Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how Boris Johnson seems to have trapped himself in a COVID battle where, in order to save face, he is now playing politics with people's very lives. And even then, he has barely any chance of winning the political fight in the end anyway. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, it's not about Brexit, of course. Brexit is the thing you would think Boris Johnson's trapping himself over. Politically, that game is still all to play for. But Johnson has himself cornered in a very messy COVID fight right now. The situation is fairly convoluted, but it is in, I suppose, two main parts. The first part is that the government's own scientific advisors told the Prime Minister that test and trace was failing to keep a lid on COVID numbers heading into autumn, and they wanted a 2-week circuit break, as they called it. A national lockdown for 2 weeks in order to get the infection rates back under control, the R value back under 1, and let test and trace recover and get on top of things. Independent scientists agreed because they were calling for this at round about the same time. We didn't know that at the time because the government scientific advice was kept secret until very recently. The problem was that this was politically awkward for Johnson because the Tory media and many of his own MPs, the majority it would seem, are dead against even his piss-poor levels of restrictions that we have in place and we've had in place for the last few months, let alone anything more stringent. He's kept quite a lot of conservative areas out of local restrictions altogether, purely to stop his own supporters raging at him too much. You know, it's bad enough that there are some areas with these restrictions. If he made it their areas, including his own backyard, well, there'd be hell to pay. There are people who complain about putting a little bit of cloth over their face to get their groceries. They will go absolutely loopy if you ask them to limit journeys away from their home altogether. So Johnson was not in a strong position politically to order another national lockdown, albeit a shorter one. Of course, as soon as it was publicly revealed that the government scientists had called for a lockdown and saying it was still needed, Labour, of course, pressed the government on why they were ignoring their own scientific advice. Needless to say, there has been no answer given to that. Which leads to the second part of the equation, messing things up for poor old Boris Johnson. He's now in a tussle with the opposition. In London, the Labour leadership is calling on the Prime Minister to follow his scientific advice and order a circuit break lockdown. Naturally, it's so much later than should have been applied, so it can't possibly do as much good now. Or to be as effective, you'd possibly have to have it last for longer. It's also possible that Johnson was planning to order the lockdown in the end anyway, but to aim for the half term. So the week after this, there's a half term. I think it applies to most of the country. There might be slight variations here and there. But, you know, with half term kids at home anyway, so you're generally used to the fact, parents are used to the fact that the kids would be out of school. It limits the economic damage if you use one of those weeks. But now he's trapped. Because if he does this, he'll be doing what Labour have called him to do for some time before. It's not just in London he's fighting the Labour Party either. It's also in the north of England. Because in Greater Manchester in particular, a bit of a battleground there, the government is trying to force the region to go into what they call Tier 3 lockdown. But without offering the financial support to those who will be making sacrifices to do so. And it's worth remembering at this point that these restrictions, in the first case, these restrictions were required, you could argue, to get on top of the pandemic. This was a fight against the pandemic and we were all in it together. That's not the case this time. These restrictions are now required because the government has messed things up big time on their COVID response. Not every country experiencing a second wave is having to contemplate this. If they had paid attention to scientists at every step, the national lockdown would not have been eased in the north of England when it was, because the rate there was still rising. It might have been falling in the south, it was rising in the north. You'd have still kept the restrictions in place in the north of England. In addition, if our test and trace was run by the NHS, as the name suggests it is, it would be a lot more efficient. In fact, the roughly quarter of the tests that take place at the hands of the NHS are carried out much more efficiently. And we'd not be in the very bad state that we are now. So you can look at it like this. The government is demanding that the people of Greater Manchester make sacrifices to deal with the situation of the government's own making All right, we all make mistakes, okay. But the government are not interested in providing adequate compensation. They're not doing their bit to help out. Now, this isn't strictly a government against Labour situation there, because one of the local leaders in Greater Manchester is a Conservative councillor. But it is certainly billed as Boris Johnson and the Conservatives against Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham and Labour. Burnham is calling for the furlough scheme to be extended for those working in the hospitality sector who would not be able to work due to the government restrictions. The government are going, all right, but we'll offer 67%, 2/3 of their salary. But it's supposed to be 80%. So we have an impasse. The government are threatening to overrule the local authorities, as they have done in other areas as well. I mean, we know how that goes. When you have any level of devolution at all, it's very poor in England, but we do have directly elected mayors, we have local authorities that have limited powers. So when you have any devolution of powers at all in a local area, and then central government comes stomping in with their size 10s to overrule them, you disenfranchise people from being able to have local matters dealt with by their choice of local leaders. It's like the Scottish independence situation in microcosm, isn't it? Heavy-handed tactics like this are a sure way to alienate you from the voters in the affected area. But again, Johnson has now trapped himself in a battle on that front as well, because it's not like there's any good reason not to extend the furlough scheme. It's not like there's arguments for and against. You know, extending the furlough scheme for targeted sectors badly hit by the current restrictions should be an obvious thing to do. Compared with what we're spending on things that are yielding us no benefit at all, it doesn't even cost very much. There isn't even a cost argument against it. But the government said a thing, and they are afraid of going back on it. And this fear is more than the usual politician's fear of making a U-turn. We have this unhealthy attitude in politics, in this country at least. Politicians should be attacked for changing their mind. If a politician gets something wrong under any genuine circumstances and changes course to move in the right direction, they actually really should be applauded, but they're not. There's the dreaded term U-turn. It's like iceberg off the starboard bow, Captain. And if they change their mind in less genuine circumstances, I mean, let's say, for example, I don't know, just to pull a random example out of the hat, you tried to use COVID to ransack the country, but then realise that it comes with consequences and maybe you'd better stop and do the right thing now. We should at least credit them with the course correction, even if we can still not forget the reason that the course correction was needed in the first place. But it's much worse for Boris Johnson. This goes beyond merely the political difficulties of a U-turn. His party is sick of his U-turns. He is a Prime Minister with a large majority in Parliament. His very tame MPs have granted him unprecedented emergency powers. Complete carte blanche to do whatever Dominic Cummings tells him he wants to do. Under no circumstances should he be making as many U-turns as he is. Occasionally you get something wrong. Sure, sometimes you misjudge the mood. Any Prime Minister can do that. You might expect the odd one. But there's so many. So many. And it doesn't just reflect poorly on Boris Johnson when he does this. Conservative MPs take flack as well, because before the U-turn, they have to defend the clearly wrong direction that the government were taking to their local constituents. So after defending a bad policy, which comes with a political cost, to then have your leadership go back on it, you look like a right tit. And also that political damage is permanent. Sometimes when you defend a bad policy, a few years later people have forgotten about it. And then you get to say, well, it didn't turn out that bad after all. And if people can't see, it's not visible enough the harm that it did, they'll go, oh yeah, it didn't turn out that bad. That can never happen when the government U-turns. Because those MPs will never be able to go, well, it didn't turn out as bad as you like, because the policy was never ran its course. So people will forever say, that was a really damaging policy you supported. Thank goodness some of your colleagues didn't. If it weren't for you, we might not have had the damage in the first place. And Conservative MPs are sick of it and have become increasingly agitated by it. So for Johnson to back down on either the financial support for those in Greater Manchester or indeed elsewhere, because if Manchester win, then others will ask for the same thing. And if Johnson backs down on the national lockdown, arguably even more so, I mean, that will be the mother of all U-turns. But at the same time, if Boris Johnson doesn't back down and order those restrictions again, it's not a risk. He's not flipping a coin here. All the experts agree. The NHS cannot cope with the current situation when winter kicks off. It can't. There's no chance of it. There's no, well, we'll just see how it goes. There is no seeing how it goes. We know how it goes. He's already left action too late. He cannot sit by and fiddle while Rome burns forever. Because do you know what? If you do that, more stuff burns. And you still have to take action at the end of it. And yes, when he does it, he will blame Labour for the necessity of doing so. I had a plan that would absolutely, totally have worked, he will say. But it won't work on enough people this time, not now. We all know that he had no scientific basis for his plan, and public opinion was already against it. So before Brexit, claims Johnson, there's still time for COVID to fatally wound him first. And why? Because he put his criminal inclinations above the good of the country. And as he said himself to the Conservative Party members during the party conference very recently, he saw COVID not as an emergency, but as an opportunity. But there we go. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.